All right, let's dive deep into Canada. We're talking history, geography, culture, the whole shebang. You ready for this?
Absolutely. Canada's got a fascinating story to tell. It's like layer upon layer of history, starting way back with its indigenous peoples. It's a really rich tapestry.
Yeah, thousands of years back, right?
Yeah.
So take us back to those early chapters. What was happening in Canada, say, 12,000 years ago?
Well, we know from archaeological evidence that the First Nations were already here at least 12,000 years ago. And then about 5,000 years ago, the Inuit arrived. Just picture that vast landscape populated by these diverse groups, each one adapting to those incredibly varied environments.
It's like the foundation for the multiculturalism Canada's known for today, right?
Definitely. It's built into the country's DNA.
So these early indigenous communities, how did they evolve over time?
Well, a lot of the early groups were nomadic, hunting and gathering to survive. But then, around 2000 BC, some regions started to shift towards more settled ways of life.
Interesting. What triggered that change?
It's hard to say for sure, but it probably had a lot to do with deepening connections to specific areas and the development of agriculture. That would have allowed for more permanent settlements.
Makes sense. It's like witnessing the roots of Canadian society, even thousands of years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And those cultural developments continued for centuries, laying the groundwork for the indigenous populations that existed long before Europeans ever arrived.
Okay, so when does that European influence start to shape this story?
Well, the arrival of Europeans really marked a turning point. It started way back in the 11th century with Norse explorers like Leif Erikson.
Vikings in Canada.
Yep. But their presence was pretty limited. Then in the late 15th century, you had guys like John Cabot and Jacques Cartier exploring the Atlantic coast. That's when things really start to change.
Yeah, because with exploration often comes the desire for, control. And I imagine that led to some clashes, right?
Generally. By the early 17th century, both France and Britain had established colonies in what's now Canada, and that, of course, led to a power struggle.
So it's not just about explorers mapping new lands anymore. It's nations vying for territory and influence.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that often involved the indigenous peoples getting caught in the middle. It was a very complex time.
So how did that power struggle play out?
Well, it all came to a head with the 7 Years' War. In 1763, the British defeated the French, taking over New France.
A major shift in power. So what happened to the French influence, especially in Quebec? Did it just disappear?
It's a good question. The British knew they had to find a way to deal with the French-speaking population. So in 1774, they enacted the Quebec Act.
What did that do?
Basically, it gave French Canadians a lot of religious and cultural freedoms. The British were trying to keep things stable and appease the French Canadians.
Smart move, I guess. But I bet not everyone was happy about that, right? Especially considering what was brewing down south in the 13 colonies.
You're right. The colonists saw the Quebec Act as a real slap in the face. They thought it was like the British choosing the French Canadians over them. And that resentment, along with a bunch of other issues, helped fuel the American Revolution.
So an act meant to keep peace in Canada ends up contributing to a revolution down south. History is full of surprises, isn't it?
It sure is.
So speaking of the American Revolution, how did that impact Canada?
Well, it had a huge impact. Thousands of colonists who stayed loyal to Britain, the Loyalists, fled to Canada.
Oh, so Canada became a haven for them. Where did they mostly settle?
Many ended up in Nova Scotia and what would become Ontario, and that influx of Loyalists really changed the makeup of Canada.
Yeah, I can imagine. So now you've got this growing English-speaking population alongside the French-speaking population. How did they manage that?
Well, it definitely created challenges. In 1791, the British decided to divide Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada.
And I'm guessing that was to try and ease tensions.
Yeah, the goal was to give both the English and French speakers more of a voice and a sense of autonomy.
It seems like a logical, albeit complicated solution. It sounds like we're starting to see the seeds of a distinct Canadian identity emerging here.
You're absolutely right. That division really set the stage for how Canada's political landscape would evolve and ultimately led to Confederation. It's the beginning of a nation forging its own path, shaped by its unique history and its diverse people.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient indigenous cultures to the arrival of Europeans and the ripple effects of the American Revolution. It's incredible how these threads intertwine to shape the very fabric of a nation.
It really is a fascinating story, and as we move forward, we'll see how Canada tackles these challenges head-on and carves out its own unique place on the world stage.
All right, so last time, we left off with Canada on the verge of a pretty massive change, becoming a nation. I'm really curious to see how all those separate provinces, with their different histories and cultures, how they all came together to create the Canada we know today.
Yeah, it's a really pivotal moment. Imagine the mid-1800s. British North America is buzzing with this energy, this political energy, and the idea of, uniting the provinces, creating this stronger, more unified entity. It's gaining traction.
So what was driving that push for Confederation? Was it a purely political thing, or was there something more?
Well, there were definitely several factors, but one big one was the United States. The U.S. had just come out of the Civil War, and there were some worries about, American expansionism northwards.
Makes sense. Uniting against a common enemy, strength in numbers, right?
Exactly. Confederation seemed like a good way to kind of bolster the colonies, safeguard their autonomy, and in the end it worked. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act came into effect, and boom, the Dominion of Canada was born.
A new nation. So which provinces were the founding members of this new Dominion?
Okay, so the first ones were Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And over time, more provinces and territories joined, extending Canada, all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that created the vast and diverse country that we know today.
It's pretty amazing to think about those early building blocks of a nation. So with this new Dominion in place, how did Canada's relationship with Britain change? Did they become independent right away?
It was more of a gradual thing, really. Canada gained self-governance in many areas, but it was still a British dominion. Some ties remained.
I see.
Yeah. But then World War I came along, and that was a big turning point.
Fighting alongside Britain, I imagine that had to strengthen those desires for independence.
Absolutely. All of a sudden, Canada was making these significant contributions on the world stage, and that fueled a growing demand for more autonomy. And this push for autonomy eventually led to the Statute of Westminster in 1931.
That was a pretty big deal, wasn't it?
It was. That was when Canada gained legislative independence. Finally, they could make their own laws without needing approval from the British Parliament.
But I'm guessing there was still some loose ends, right?
Yeah, there were a few constitutional matters that still needed British involvement. It wasn't complete independence just yet. And that became a real sticking point for those who wanted a truly independent Canada.
I can imagine. So even with this newfound legislative independence, Canada wasn't completely free from Britain's influence. That had to create some tension.
It did. It was a tricky situation, this quest for complete independence. It wasn't just about the legal side of things. It was about, what it meant to be Canadian, that evolving sense of identity.
So with those lingering constitutional ties and a changing Canadian identity, what were some of the big challenges that Canada faced in the 20th century? I know Quebec's desire for sovereignty has been a big issue, right?
Oh, absolutely. Quebec's push for sovereignty, it's been a really defining part of Canada's modern history, and a turbulent one at times, for sure. And it's complicated, it's rooted in cultural identity, language rights, and historical grievances. It's multi-layered.
It sounds like it. When did this movement for Quebec sovereignty really start to pick up steam?
Well, the seeds were planted a while back, but the movement gained real momentum in the 1960s during what's called the Quiet Revolution. It was like this surge in Quebecois nationalism.
It was more about ideas and aspirations than actual fighting.
Exactly. It was a shift in mindset, rejecting the old ways of doing things, demanding self-determination. But this push for greater autonomy, well, it did lead to some more radical factions.
And that's where the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec, comes in.
Yeah, exactly. They were a separatist group, a paramilitary group, and they were willing to use violence to get their point across. And the most well-known event associated with them was the October Crisis in 1970.
That was a really scary time. What exactly happened?
The FLQ kidnapped James Cross, the British Trade Commissioner, and Pierre Laporte, the Quebec Labor Minister. And they made demands like releasing FLQ members from prison, broadcasting their manifesto, things like that.
I can imagine the panic. How did the Canadian government respond?
Well, Prime Minister Trudeau, he invoked the War Measures Act. It gave the government a lot of power, to arrest and detain people without needing warrants.
A pretty drastic move.
It was definitely controversial, but Trudeau said it was necessary. He had to ensure public safety, restore order.
So what happened in the end? Did the FLQ get what they wanted?
Tragically, Pierre Laporte was murdered by the kidnappers. James Cross was released, but only after the kidnappers were given safe passage to Cuba. So, no, the FLQ didn't achieve their goals, but the crisis left a mark on Canada, a big one.
It sounds like it was a real turning point, exposing these deep divisions within the country, the urgent need to, really address Quebec's concerns.
You got it. The October crisis forced Canada to look in the mirror, It sparked a real effort to find a way to reconcile Quebec's desire for more autonomy with the unity of the country.
And I guess that's where the referendums on Quebec sovereignty come in.
Right. Quebec held referendums, one in 1980 and another one in 1995. Basically, the question was, should Quebec separate from Canada?
And what was the outcome?
Both times, the vote was no, but it was close, really close. It showed just how divided the province was and still is on this issue.
So even within Quebec, there wasn't a clear consensus. It's a really complex challenge. But were there other big issues facing Canada in this period? Didn't something happen with Air India?
Oh, yeah. In 1985, Air India Flight 182, it was flying from Montreal to London, and it was blown up by a bomb.
That's awful.
It was. All 329 people on board died. It's still the deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history.
Do we know who was behind it?
The investigation pointed to Sikh extremists who were based in Canada. It was a devastating event, a real wake-up call about security vulnerabilities. And it had a lasting impact on the Sikh community, of course.
A terrible tragedy. Were there any other events that really shaped Canada during this time?
Another big one was the Oka crisis. It happened in 1990, a land dispute between a Mohawk community and the town of Oka in Quebec. It turned into this 78-day standoff, and it really highlighted the ongoing struggles for a reconciliation between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples.
It seems like Canada was facing pressures from both inside and outside. But even with all that going on, Canada was also making a name for itself on the world stage, especially with peacekeeping, right?
That's right. Canada's been really committed to peacekeeping. They see it as like a core part of their foreign policy.
Why is that?
I think it comes from a belief in multilateralism. Canada genuinely wants to contribute to, global stability. When did they first get involved in peacekeeping?
It was during the Suez Crisis in 1956, their first big mission. And since then, they've been involved in more than 50 UN peacekeeping missions all over the world.
Wow, that's impressive.
It is. It shows how dedicated Canada is to promoting peace. But have there been times when they decided not to get involved in military action?
Yeah, definitely. For example, Canada didn't participate in the Vietnam War or the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They didn't want to get involved in conflicts that weren't sanctioned by the UN.
It sounds like Canada's pretty careful about when and where they use military force.
I think that's fair to say, but things have shifted a bit in recent decades.
How so?
Well, they've become more involved in UN-sanctioned military operations through NATO.
So more of a militarized approach.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It's led to Canada taking a more active role in things like the intervention in Libya and the fight against ISIS.
And that probably sparked some debate back home, right?
Yeah.
About how involved Canada should be in these kinds of conflicts.
For sure. It's a tough question, finding that balance between traditional peacekeeping and, a more interventionist approach.
It's complicated. But regardless of the approach, it's clear that Canada's committed to being a player on the world stage. But what about at home? How has Canada, with its history of different cultural influences and its diverse population, how has it created its own unique identity?
That's a great question, and it brings us to one of the things that Canada's most known for: multiculturalism.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the amazing landscapes of Canada. I've always been fascinated by those iconic images, the snow-capped mountains and those vast forests. I'm ready to explore the wilds of Canada.
Well, get ready to be blown away because the scale and diversity of Canada's landscapes is truly something else. I mean, it's the second largest country in the world, right? It stretches across 6 time zones, from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, and then up north to the Arctic. It's mind-boggling.
Okay, paint us a picture. What are some of the most iconic geographical features we'd see if we were to trek across Canada?
Okay, so let's start in the west with the majestic Canadian Rockies. Those mountains are home to some of the highest peaks in North America, and they've got these world-famous national parks like Banff and Jasper. Just picture those rugged, snow-capped peaks, glaciers, pristine alpine lakes. It's a nature lover's dream.
Sounds incredible. So we've got mountains. What happens as we head east? What's next on our journey?
Okay, so as you move east from the Rockies, you hit the Canadian prairies. And I'm talking vast, seemingly endless stretches of farmland. Super fertile, too. This region is like Canada's breadbasket, feeding not just the country, but contributing to global food security as well.
Mountains and prairies. It's already so diverse. What else is there?
Keep heading east and you'll run into the Canadian Shield. It's this massive expanse of ancient rock, covers almost half the country, super rugged and wild, tons of lakes and rivers scattered throughout, and it's home to the iconic boreal forest.
Okay, wait, the boreal forest. What's so special about that? I feel like I've heard that name before.
It's actually the largest intact forest on the planet. I mean, it circles the entire globe across the northern hemisphere. It's a crucial carbon sink, helping to regulate the climate. And the biodiversity there is just off the charts.
Wow, that's incredible right here in Canada. It really shows how important the country is for global environmental conservation.
It does. But here's where things get interesting. You've got this vast Canadian Shield, which is pretty sparsely populated, right? But then in the south, you've got the Quebec City-Windsor corridor, where most of the population is concentrated, along with the industrial heartland.
It's crazy how one country can have such different landscapes and population densities. I imagine that creates some unique challenges.
Definitely. Connecting those sparsely populated northern areas with the bustling urban centers down south, that takes some serious infrastructure and a real commitment to, bridging that gap.
Yeah, things like transportation, communication, healthcare, education. I can see how that would be tricky.
For sure. But Canada's done some pretty amazing things when it comes to infrastructure. Have you ever heard of the Trans-Canada Highway?
Oh yeah, isn't that like one of the longest highways in the world?
It is. Over 8,000 kilometers long, stretching from Victoria, British Columbia, all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland. Imagine driving across the entire country. It would be an epic road trip, seeing all those different landscapes, meeting people from all walks of life.
Now that's a road trip I'd sign up for. Okay, but what about other natural wonders? Any record-breaking lakes or parks we should know about?
Oh, tons. Canada's got Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area. That's the world's largest freshwater protected area. And you can't forget Algonquin Provincial Park, massive forests, tons of lakes, incredible wildlife. It's a classic Canadian experience.
Right, I'm convinced. I'm adding Canada to my travel list. But before we wrap up, we have to touch on something else that Canada's really good at: science and technology.
Absolutely. Canada has this long and really impressive history of innovation. I mean, they're consistently ranked among the top countries in the world for scientific research, and they're leaders in fields like aerospace, medicine, you name it.
Give us some examples. What kind of Canadian inventions or discoveries have made a global impact?
Okay, so back in 1962, Canada launched its very first satellite, Alouette 1. A huge step for space exploration. And then, of course, there's the Canadarm.
Oh, yeah, the Canadarm. I remember seeing those images of it on the International Space Station. So cool. What else has Canada been up to in the world of technology?
Canada's a big player in AI, renewable energy, and medical breakthroughs. They've got world-class universities and research institutions, and they put their money where their mouth is. They invest billions in research and development every year. They're really committed to pushing the boundaries.
It's pretty amazing to see how this nation, with its vast landscapes, diverse cultures, and all those historical challenges, how it's become this global leader in so many different fields.
It really is. And you know what? Even after all this, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover about Canada.
I couldn't agree more. There's always something new to learn, a new story to uncover. That's what makes it so captivating.
Exactly. So to our listener, I want to leave you with this. What about Canada intrigues you the most? What do you want to learn more about?
Go explore. Find those hidden gems. Maybe even experience Canada for yourself. It's a country that will stay with you long after you've left. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into all things Canada.